She smoothed her apron and checked the roast, not knowing that in 1954 what she knew by heart would one day be nearly extinct. What did she know that we forgot? Picture the dining room of a brand new house outside Philadelphia. The table already set for 8, candles unlit but ready, a record warming up on the console in the next room. This was not a special occasion. This was a Tuesday. Across post-war America, in houses built for people who had never owned a dining room before, an entire generation of women turned ordinary evenings into small productions, and they did it from nothing, with no domestic help, no rule book, just instinct, borrowed etiquette, and care. Before we go further, you have to understand something most people get wrong about this era. It was not about being rich. It was not about servants and silver trays carried by hired help. The post-war dinner party was a homemade production, built entirely by the woman of the house, and that is exactly what made it remarkable. Here is the number that changes how you see all of this. In 1940, fewer than half of American families owned their own home. By 1960, that number had climbed to roughly 62%. The GY Bill and its low-cost mortgages did not just build houses, they built dining rooms, and for the first time in American history, a dedicated room for entertaining guests belonged to ordinary families, not just the wealthy few. Levittown, New York is the place most historians point to first. Between 1947 and 1951, roughly 17,400 houses went up there, priced around $8,000, and every single one of them included a real dining space as a standard feature, not a luxury upgrade. That decision, made by a builder trying to move houses fast, quietly rewired American social life for the next 2 decades. Now picture the woman actually running this house. She has no maid. She has no cook. Her own mother might have had household help, but she does not, and neither does anyone on her block. She is the architect, the caterer, the florist, and the cleanup crew, all in one apron, and she is expected to make it look effortless. This is where the etiquette books come in, and I want you to picture them not as stuffy rule books, but as survival manuals for exactly this woman. Amy Vanderbilt published her complete book of etiquette in 1952, and unlike the older guides written for households with staff, hers was aimed directly at the new suburban homemaker, doing every bit of this labor herself on a real budget in a real kitchen. The ritual was never written down, but every good hostess knew it by heart. Vanderbilt and her predecessor Emily Post were not writing rules for their own sake. They were translating a whole system of unspoken knowledge passed down informally for generations into something a young bride with no mother nearby could actually learn and use on her own. Emily Post herself is worth pausing on. She was born into old money, into a world that assumed servants and inherited silver, and her original book from 1922 reflected that. But by the post-war editions, her publishers had to rebuild huge sections of it, because for the first time, ordinary families were buying her book, not just the socially prominent. So let's walk into that dining room properly, because the details matter more than people realize. A formal cover, as the etiquette books called it, could include as many as 3 forks, 2 or 3 knives, 2 spoons, a bread plate, a butter knife, a water goblet, and 1 or 2 wine glasses. And this was not showing off. It was considered baseline competence. Here is something that surprises people every time I mention it. Etiquette manuals of the era were adamant that a centerpiece had to stay low. Not because tall flowers were expensive or hard to find, but because guests needed to see each other across the table. The whole point of the evening was conversation, and nothing, not even a beautiful arrangement, was allowed to block it. There is a whole world hiding in what nobody thought to save. Think about place cards. Today we associate them with weddings, but in 1954, a hostess used them for an ordinary dinner party of 8 or 10 people, deliberately alternating men and women, separating married couples, seating a shy guest next to someone who could draw them out. It was social engineering, disguised as a folded card. Now let's talk about the invitation itself, because even that had a rhythm most of us have lost. A proper dinner invitation went out 1 to 2 weeks in advance, often a handwritten note or a phone call followed by a written confirmation. And an RSVP was not optional. It was expected within a few days, and ignoring one was treated as a real social offense. And when guests actually arrived, there was a custom baked into the visit itself. Bring something, but bring it thoughtfully. Flowers already arranged, so the hostess never had to hunt for a vase mid-party. A small box of chocolates. A bottle for the evening. Etiquette guides even listed what not to bring, because a careless gift could embarrass everyone involved. Now step into the living room, because the cocktail hour deserves its own chapter. This was not just drinking before dinner. It was a deliberately timed buffer, usually 30 to 45 minutes, long enough for strangers and old friends alike to relax into the evening, short enough that the roast in the oven never suffered for it. The bar cart itself was practically a required piece of furniture. A proper setup meant a cocktail shaker, matched jiggers, rocks glasses, highball glasses, all coordinated, all ready. The hostess repertoire ran through Manhattans, old fashions, martinis, and whiskey sours, and knowing how to make them correctly was simply part of running a household. I want to introduce someone here because her story shows how far this world of home entertaining reached. Brownie Wise was a divorced single mother in Detroit who started selling plastic kitchenware through home demonstration parties, turning an ordinary evening among neighbors into a business. She proved the model worked so well that Tupperware pulled its product out of stores entirely in 1951, choosing to sell only through parties like hers. By 1954, Brownie Wise had become a vice president at Tupperware and the first woman ever to appear on the cover of Business Week. Her sales conferences in Kissimmee, Florida, became legendary industry events. Think about what that means. The same living room ritual we are talking about tonight, the home gathering, the careful hospitality, doubled as a launching pad for one of the first great female business careers in America. It disappeared from dinner parties, but it still works. I am talking about the low centerpiece rule, the seating chart, the timed cocktail hour. These were not arbitrary customs. They were solutions to a real problem. How do you make a room full of near strangers feel instantly comfortable together, and every one of them still works exactly as well today as it did in 1954? Let's talk about what was actually on the table, because the food itself was part of the performance. A roast, often beef or a good-sized bird, was the centerpiece of the meal, flanked by a starch, a vegetable dressed up with a sauce, and a homemade or carefully chosen dessert. None of it was exotic. All of it was deliberate, plated with real intention, because presentation was part of respect for the guest. Now here is a number worth sitting with. A dozen eggs cost around 60 cents in the mid-1950s. A pound of round steak ran close to 90 cents. This was not an expensive night. A full dinner party for 8, food included, likely cost somewhere between $8 and $15 total. The magic was never the money. It was the hours of attention poured into every part of the evening. Your grandmother knew how to make a room feel like home, and she did it without a single dollar of hired help. That is the part of this story that deserves more credit than it gets. The competence on display at one of these dinners, the timing, the seating, the food, the conversation, all of it was self-taught, self-managed, and entirely her own achievement. This is worth saying plainly, because it is easy to misread this era as pure obligation. For many homemakers, hosting was one of the very few arenas where a woman had complete authority, complete creative control, and a real chance to be admired publicly for her skill and taste. Losing that ritual also meant losing one of the few stages where her competence was seen and celebrated. Let's talk about the calling card for a moment, because even by the 1950s, it was already a ghost of what it used to be. In the Victorian era, an engraved card with a folded corner meant a genuine personal visit. By the post-war years, that formal system had faded, but its echo survived. A card left with a gift, a card tucked in when the hostess wasn't home. A vanished layer beneath an already vanishing layer. Here is a misconception worth clearing up directly. People assume all of this formality was about status, about looking down on anyone who didn't know the rules. But read the etiquette books themselves and the tone is different. The rules exist, so nobody has to guess. So the guest always knows what fork to use next, and the hostess never has to explain herself. Formality, done right, removes anxiety. It doesn't create it. Now let's turn to the room itself, the parlor, because it deserves its own moment. Before the television took over the living room, this space was built entirely around face-to-face conversation. Card tables came out, records played low, chairs were arranged in a circle, not toward a screen. The furniture told you exactly what the room was for. The parlor remembers, even when we forget. That phrase means something specific here. The room itself still exists in a lot of old houses today, but its purpose has been erased so thoroughly that most people walking through one now would never guess what it was originally built to do. By the late 1950s, television had reached somewhere around 85 to 90% of American households, and that number matters more than it looks like at first. Because as the set moved into the living room, it slowly reorganized the furniture around it and reorganized the evening along with it. The parlor started becoming a den. People love to blame the TV dinner for killing all of this, and I understand why. The name alone makes for a tidy villain. But when Swanson introduced its frozen turkey dinner around 1953 and 1954, it was marketed specifically for weeknights, for when you didn't have time to cook, for eating alone or with just the family. It was built as the opposite of the dinner party, not its replacement. So if the TV dinner didn't kill the dinner party, what actually did? The honest answer is slower and less satisfying than a single villain. Suburbs kept spreading further from each other. More women moved into full-time paid work through the 60s and 70s. Culture generally drifted toward informality. And the living room, room by room, kept reorganizing itself around the screen instead of the guest. Think about the TV tray itself as a small symbol of everything we've covered tonight. It was built for one person, eating alone, facing a screen. Compare that to the dining table, built for 8 people facing each other. 2 pieces of furniture, 2 completely different ideas about what an evening is for. There is a whole world hiding in what nobody thought to save. Nobody photographed the seating chart. Nobody preserved the centerpiece height rule in a museum. These were oral, practical traditions carried in the heads of women who never wrote memoirs, and most of that knowledge simply evaporated along with the generation that held it. It is worth being honest about the other side of this too, because Nancy deserves the full picture, not a postcard. Not every household had the money, the time, or frankly the desire for all this formality, and plenty of women found the constant performance genuinely exhausting. The ritual was beautiful. It was also a great deal of unpaid, invisible labor every single week. And yet, even holding both of those truths at once, something real was lost. Not the workload. Nobody is arguing for bringing back 3 hours of unpaid dishwashing. What was lost was the ritual of gathering itself, the idea that an ordinary Tuesday deserved real effort, that neighbors were worth dressing up for. Let's look at the invitation etiquette one more time, because there is a detail worth sitting with. A phone call alone was not considered sufficient for a formal dinner in many circles. It needed a written note to follow, something the guest could keep, reread, and plan around. That small extra step turned a passing thought into a real commitment on both sides. Now I want to walk you through an actual evening, start to finish, the way it would have unfolded in a typical suburban home around 1955. Guests arrive at 7 on time because arriving early was considered almost as rude as arriving late. The hostess greets them at the door herself, takes their coats, and the cocktail hour begins immediately. By roughly 7:45, drinks wind down and the hostess makes her move to the dining room, usually with a simple, practiced phrase inviting everyone to the table. This transition was choreographed, not improvised. Everyone understood the signal, and nobody lingered too long over their glass once it came. Dinner itself typically ran for an hour, sometimes longer, moving through courses at an unhurried pace, because rushing a guest through a meal was considered a small insult. Conversation was expected to flow the entire time, and the hostess quietly managed it, redirecting a lull, drawing out a quiet guest, never once looking like she was working at all. After dinner, the group returned to the living room for coffee and a lighter dessert, sometimes cards, sometimes music, and this second act often ran another hour or two. Guests were expected to leave by a reasonable hour, and a well-trained hostess had subtle, polite cues ready for exactly this moment, so the evening ended as gracefully as it began. Compare that full arc: greeting, cocktails, dinner, coffee, cards, graceful farewell, to how most of us spend a Tuesday night now. It disappeared from dinner parties, but it still works, and I think that's the real ache underneath all this nostalgia. Not that the exact rules were perfect, but that the intention behind them, real focused hospitality, has nearly vanished from ordinary life. Let's go back to the china cabinet for a moment, because what was inside it tells its own story. A young bride in the 1950s typically received her formal china, crystal, and silver as wedding gifts, registered specifically for that purpose, and it was meant to last her entire adult life. This wasn't casual tableware, it was an investment in decades of future hosting. Bridal registries at department stores like Marshall Field's and various local jewelers became a genuine ritual of their own by the 1950s, with couples selecting patterns they expected to use for the rest of their married life. Compare that to how disposable so much of our tableware culture has become since, and you start to see how differently that generation thought about permanence. Now, a word about the men in this picture. Because the dinner party was not exclusively a woman's domain, even if the labor mostly was. The husband typically handled the bar, mixing drinks, refilling glasses, playing genial host at the threshold of the living room, while his wife orchestrated everything happening in the kitchen just out of sight. It was a genuine partnership, even if an unequal one by today's standards. He greeted, poured, and told the stories that kept the room laughing. She built the meal, timed every course, and made sure nothing ever felt rushed. Both roles required real skill, and both were, quietly, forms of performance for the guests in the room. Let's talk about music for a moment, because a dinner party without it would have felt incomplete. A record playing low in the background, something like Nat King Cole or a big band standard, was almost mandatory, chosen carefully to support conversation rather than compete with it. Nobody wanted a song so loud that guests had to raise their voices to be heard. Clothing mattered too, and not casually. A formal dinner party called for a cocktail dress or a nice suit, even among neighbors who saw each other constantly. Dressing up was a form of respect for the occasion itself, a signal that this evening, however ordinary the reason, deserved real effort from everyone walking through the door. It disappeared from dinner parties, but it still works. That phrase applies here too. You do not need a full cocktail dress to signal to your guests that tonight matters. Even a small gesture of effort, tidying a room, lighting a candle, setting the table with a bit more care than usual, sends the same message the 1950s hostess understood instinctively. Now consider the neighborhood itself as part of this machine. Suburban blocks built in the same few years by the same developer, filled with young families at similar life stages, created a kind of built-in social network that simply does not exist the same way today. Between 1950 and 1960, the suburban population grew by roughly 46%, and every one of those new families needed a social life to match their new house. That density of nearby, similarly situated families meant a hostess could invite the couple 3 doors down on a Tuesday with almost no planning at all. Proximity did half the work that today would require a calendar app, a group chat, and 3 rounds of rescheduling just to get 4 people in the same room. Let's return to Amy Vanderbilt one more time, because her career itself is a small mirror of everything we've discussed. She was not a socialite. She was a working journalist who built an entire second career, translating unwritten social knowledge into something teachable. In doing so, she helped an entire generation of women who had no mother nearby to ask. It is easy to romanticize all of this. So let's stay honest a moment longer. Not every dinner party went smoothly. Etiquette books are full of quiet warnings about the guest who overstayed, the dish that failed, the awkward silence nobody could fill. The rules existed precisely because these evenings could go wrong, and often did, in ways no amount of preparation could fully prevent. But even the failures were absorbed by the ritual itself. A hostess who knew the etiquette had a script to fall back on when something went sideways, a graceful line, a quick redirection, a way to smooth over a burnt dish or an awkward guest without anyone quite noticing the recovery. That is what real hosting skill actually looks like, not perfection, but composure under pressure. Let's take a moment to look at the broader etiquette landscape of the decade, because Post and Vanderbilt were not the only voices. Women's magazines like Ladies' Home Journal and Good Housekeeping ran monthly entertaining columns, complete with sample menus, seating diagrams, and reader questions answered by an in-house etiquette expert. This meant a homemaker in a small town far from any big city could still access the exact same guidance as a woman entertaining in Manhattan. Print media, more than any single etiquette book, is what actually democratized this whole system of knowledge across the entire country, reaching kitchens no formal book ever would. There is a whole world hiding in what nobody thought to save, and sample menus from those magazines are a perfect example. A typical spring dinner menu might list a chilled soup, a roast chicken with a lemon glaze, rice pilaf, a green vegetable, and a simple layered cake, each course timed to the minute so nothing sat too long or arrived cold. Let's think about what all of this really trained a hostess to do, beyond cooking or setting a table. It trained her to read a room, to notice the guest who had gone quiet, the couple who seemed tense the moment energy started to sag. Hosting well required a kind of social intelligence that etiquette books could point toward but never fully teach. That instinct, more than any fork placement or centerpiece height, is probably the real lost art here. Not the mechanics of the table, which anyone can relearn from an old book in an afternoon, but the patient, practiced attentiveness to other people that an entire evening of hosting demanded and rewarded. Let's look at holidays specifically, because they show the formal dinner party at its absolute peak. Thanksgiving and Christmas dinners in the 1950s often extended the everyday rules to their fullest expression: formal place settings for extended family, multiple courses, and hours of planning that began sometimes a full week in advance. What strikes me is how much of that holiday intensity has survived into today, even as the ordinary Tuesday version disappeared almost completely. We still bring out the good china at Thanksgiving. We still set a formal table at Christmas. The instinct never fully died. It just retreated to the 2 or 3 days a year when we still give ourselves permission for it. Let's return to the etiquette manuals one last time and talk about something practical, the thank you note. A guest was expected to write and mail a handwritten thank you note within a day or two of any dinner party, a small ritual that closed the loop on the entire evening and confirmed the relationship for the next invitation. That single habit, the thank you note, did more to sustain a social circle over years than almost anything else in this whole ritual. It told a hostess her effort had been seen and appreciated, and it quietly guaranteed she would be invited back into the cycle the next time someone else hosted. Let's take stock of where we've traveled tonight. A homeownership boom that put dining rooms in ordinary hands. A generation of homemakers who built an entire art form from instinct and borrowed etiquette. A living room slowly reorganized around a screen instead of a guest. And underneath all of it, a genuine, practiced skill at making people feel welcome. This channel exists because so much of that skill was never written into a museum plaque or a history textbook. It lived in kitchens, in the muscle memory of women who never called themselves experts, who just quietly knew how to do this, and taught their daughters by doing it in front of them, week after week, year after year. Your grandmother knew how to make a room feel like home. That is not a small thing, and it is not something we should file away as a quaint curiosity from a bygone decade. It was a real skill, developed under real constraints, and most of it is still entirely usable right now, in whatever kitchen you happen to be standing in tonight. It is worth acknowledging, one more time, why this all faded rather than framing it as some sudden betrayal. More women working full-time by the 1970s meant less unpaid hours available for multi-day meal planning. Suburbs spread further apart. Culture as a whole drifted toward comfort and informality. None of that is a tragedy on its own. It is just change, arriving gradually the way most real change does. But something is still worth grieving in it, quietly, without exaggeration. The idea that an ordinary evening with people you know deserves real, visible effort. That conversation is worth protecting from distraction. That a table set with care says something to the people sitting around it that a couch and a takeout container simply cannot say. This channel isn't asking you to recreate every fork placement or host a 5-course dinner every Tuesday night. Nobody has the time, and frankly, nobody needs to. What it is asking is smaller and more honest. Borrow one piece of this, the low centerpiece, the timed cocktail hour, the handwritten note the next morning. It disappeared from dinner parties, but it still works. Try it once, on an ordinary night with no occasion at all, and watch what happens to the room. That is really the whole thesis of this channel, distilled into one small experiment you can run in your own kitchen this week. I keep coming back to that image from the very start, the woman checking her roast, not knowing that decades later, strangers on the other side of a screen would still be trying to understand exactly what she knew. That is the strange gift of this kind of history. The people who lived it never thought of it as remarkable. They just thought of it as Tuesday. There is a whole world hiding in what nobody thought to save, and that is exactly why this channel exists, to go looking for it. One forgotten ritual at a time, and hand it back to you the way it was originally meant to be used, not as a museum piece, but as something you can actually do tonight. So the next time you are tempted to eat standing over the sink, or scatter takeout containers across the coffee table in front of a screen, remember there is another way, one your own family very likely practiced not that long ago. It didn't require money, it required intention, and intention is something anyone can still choose. The Parlor remembers, even when we forget, and that is really the whole reason I make these videos. If tonight made you want to light a candle at your own table, even for an ordinary dinner with no occasion at all, then something your grandmother knew has just quietly made its way back into the world. If you loved digging into this with me, come sit in the parlor a while longer. Subscribe, and I will keep pulling these forgotten rituals out of old etiquette books, faded magazines, and family stories, one evening at a time, so none of it has to disappear for good. I will see you at the next table.